Hi, everybody. It's Bill Whittle. Welcome to the Stratosphere Lounge and yet another restart on yet another day of technical errors, but we're going to ignore all of that. We're running a little bit late. We're going to go a little bit late because we've got a fun evening for you tonight. Stratosphere Lounge episode 11 is going to be featuring the Sci-fi Extravaganza. Yes, the Sci-fi Extravaganza begins now. As I said earlier, as we had to restart because of technical problems, but we are going to try and pack 24 pounds of sci-fi geekdom and nerddom into a 20-pound package, and I'm telling you now, especially after the technical problems and a restart again, we are going to go as long as we have to go. We're just going to go as long as it takes. So that's that. And I think we might have our picture back and everything looks copacetic. Got a weird ad here now. I'm going to have my own internet one day. You know that? I'm just going to have my own internet, and I won't have to worry about this anymore. I'm just going to have an internet, and I could make that guy go away. Okay, here we go. So, the Stratosphere Lounge Sci-Fi Extravaganza begins, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about science fiction shows. We're going to compare them to one another. We got some great questions, as usual, from our comment section on Facebook, and we are going to begin with a brief discussion of the sci-fi show that changed my life. Yes, this is the show that actually changed my life, like watching the Thunderbirds back in 1965 or seeing the GM's Futurama exhibit at the World's Fair in 1964. Some things just rewired my brain, and this TV show about explorers in space did that exactly for me. Oh, who saw that coming? Lost in Space, ladies and gentlemen. Lost in Space, not Star Trek. I didn't see Star Trek until I was probably 12, 13 years old. First time I saw Lost in Space, I was a boy of about 6 or 7 living in Bermuda, watched it on television there, and I about lost my mind. I know a lot of people have a problem with Lost in Space, and I've watched all the episodes lately. I've got the DVD sets, and you can find them on Hulu for free. And I can't believe how bad that show is. I can't believe it. It's like I think somebody went back and like remade the show. Because I loved it. I loved it when I was a kid. Then as I got to look at all 3 different seasons together, I realized that the first season, this is a still from the first season, was actually a pretty good show. It was an action-adventure show, and it was scary. And Dr. Smith wasn't this whatever he was, some kind of ballet instructor with a nuclear degree and murder on his mind. He was just a straight villain and an ominous villain. And at the beginning of the first episode of Lost in Space, the robot destroys the guidance system on the Jupiter 2, and then they enter a meteor field, and then they're getting close to the comet or something. Some comet was generating a lot of heat, apparently. But John Robinson has to go out on a spacewalk, and I'm watching him going out on the spacewalk, and then the safety line breaks, and then boom, he's floating out there, and he's floating away, and I'm 5 or 6 years old, and all the family's pressed up at the glass, and he's getting further and further and further. I say, how are they going to save this guy? And all of a sudden it's like, doo-doo-doom, doo-doo-doom. Tune in next week, same time, same station, and I'm here to tell you, I did, in fact, tune in next week. I tuned in every week. I couldn't get enough of that show. I think one of the worst nights of my life, was when I came home and it was like 8 o'clock or 8:10 or something, and I didn't think anything of it. I was getting ready to go out and do something, and I realized it was Lost in Space night, and I've missed the show. It's just ended, and for DVDs and VCRs. Ha 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 ha. This is 1965, and I realized I'd missed the show, and that was the first time in my life. I was 6 or 7 years old, something like that. It's the first time in my life that the absolute tyranny of time sank into my little boy brain, because the idea that I had missed it and I couldn't go back and see it and I couldn't undo it. It was undoable. It was done, and I couldn't change it. I thought I was going to go nuts. But Lost in Space appealed to me, obviously, because of space and science and all that science fiction stuff. But it was Will Robinson, right? Here's a guy who was kind of your reward for being like the science geek. I didn't know what the word geek meant. I didn't know that it was unusual to be really interested in all this stuff. I just saw Will Robinson doing things and fixing things, and then Will Robinson going out there with a laser gun and just shooting things. Just good boy, son. I told you to stay in the Jupiter, but Thanks for coming to save me from shooting that giant one-eyed monster on top of that hill. How good does that get? And those laser guns were bitching too. They were absolutely awesome. They were really big, they were like long and had this big thing on the end. It was like, poof. I don't know why anybody could add anything other than that. It was just fantastic. But of course, you can't even really call Lost in Space science fiction. It was just kind of an action show. And really, when it was said and done, it turned rapidly into a kid's show. And I always look back on it. I always look back on Lost in Space, like I said, like somebody remade it, because it got so unbelievably awful. Just unbelievably awful. And the great example, of course, is I think their final episode or next to final episode was called The Great Vegetable Rebellion, where Dr. Smith fights a giant carrot, a guy in a carrot suit. And Smith turns into a pea or a pumpkin. Oh my God. But I often wondered culturally why they took the show in that direction. And they're making it for kids, and then it looks like they're making it for preteens, and then they look like they're making it for, zygotes. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And then I realized, or maybe somebody suggested it to me, that what happened to Lost in Space between the first season, which was actually pretty cool. They're in the chariot in the first season, and the planet's on an elliptical orbit, and it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and they have to go south, or it's getting colder, and they have to go south, and it gets hotter, and then the ice melts, and it was really pretty cool adventure. And John Robinson flying around in the jetpack, that was fantastic. But it turned into this thing, and I wanted to know what happened. And I think what happened was, are you ready for this, sports fans? What happened to Lost in Space was Batman. Batman happened to Lost in Space. Because I loved Batman too. I loved it. I had a Batman suit, and I'd sit down by the side of the road, and I'd have my cape and my cowl and my Batman logo, and I'd defend the driveway against the Joker or whoever might happen to pull up. I'd love to stand there, my hands on the hips, and the wind blowing the cape. I was Batman. And I watched Batman as a kid, and I never thought Batman was intended to be funny. I took Batman 100% seriously. 100% seriously. I thought Batman was a serious adventure. It's only when I got older that I realized, no, actually, turns out they were having a little bit of fun with Batman. Now, I can't watch Lost in Space because of the camp, but I love Batman because of the camp. I love it. I think Adam West is psychotic and not really on this earth the way the rest of us are, but I think he was a genius on Batman. Pow! Pop! Flint 350. Zap! It was a blast. I took it seriously. Took Lost in Space seriously too. But enough of an introduction, because we don't want to spend too much time on this stuff, because Batman is John the Baptist to the coming of the sci-fi Jesus for me and for most everyone else out there of my age. So here's what you got. You got this thing, which is on CBS, and it's a kids show. And this premiered, I think, in 1964. So CBS has their space show. And NBC says, well, we want a space show too. So you go from this thing, which started out okay and turned into a laughingstock. And you go from that and you turn into this. And you just realize, oh my goodness gracious, what happened? I was about 10 or 12 when I first saw Star Trek. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do when I first saw Star Trek. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. Star Trek is without question science fiction. And we're going to talk later on in the show about Aurora, the science fiction movie and franchise, an entire franchise that I want to do. And the tagline for Aurora basically is no magic. Star Trek had the kind of science that looked like magic, but Star Trek was magic. I'm sorry, Star Trek was science. It was science fiction. Star Trek wasn't fantasy in the way that Star Wars is fantasy. Star Trek was science fiction. And Star Trek always gave you enough of an understanding of what it was trying to accomplish. I'm just talking about the science now. We'll get to the whole bigger issue of Star Trek in a second. But all of the science in Star Trek was explained to a degree that you could at least imagine it. It wasn't just like Han Solo hits a lever and you had a warp drive and you had warp nacelles, and they were Bassard scoops on the warp nacelles that scooped up interstellar hydrogen, and then you start to find out over time that the warp system basically doesn't move the Enterprise. It basically compresses space in front of the ship and expands space behind it, and space moves around the ship, and it moves in a warp bubble through subspace. And you get all these neat little fig leaves that, strangely enough, actually make a kind of sense. It worked. The transporter, the first time you saw the transporter, you didn't have to be explained why the transporter works. You see 5 guys standing in a little chamber like a giant shower, and then you cut to the surface of the planet, and they're there. Got it. Turns out they're building transporters. I believe they've actually physically transported a proton, an atomic particle is moved from one place to another by means of an electronic transmission and reconstituted at the other end. Amazing. Many people say, of course, that that many of the smaller pieces of technology in Star Trek have already come to fruition. Absolutely true. The tricorder was a fantastic thing. We're going to get into the mythology of Star Trek. I'm just dealing with the tech, just the geeky stuff. We'll get into the depth in a second. But I was thinking about the tricorder, which you hold up, and you analyze things, and the communicators, which, imagine that. You could talk to somebody with something this big, and you hold it in your pocket. Revolutionary concept. Never be out of touch. What's fascinating to me is the tricorder didn't have anything like the kind of capabilities that our iPhone have. But the idea of walking around with a little device, I don't know if you can see the app I've got here. Maybe there you go. Are you ready? Ready, fans? No, if I got the thing on mute, no, sorry. Try that again. Ready? Awesome. It's a little Star Trek app. I don't even know what it's called. It's for the iPhone, obviously, but you can do all kinds of stupid things.
Two to beam up, Scotty.
That guy's an American Adonis. He's an American Apollo.
Kirk to Enterprise. Enterprise, come in. Kirk to Enterprise.
Kirk to Enterprise. Enterprise, come in. Kirk to Enterprise. He's got better things to do with his time than make Earl Grey tea. One more just for giggles.
4 hours before the ship blows up.
I just love this app. But, the thing that's incredible about the app is you get the app. This is hilarious. If you really think about this is actually kind of a deep point. Go get the iPhone app that turns your iPhone into a communicator, and then use your iPhone as a Star Trek communicator, and realize how infinitely worse the Star Trek communicator is than the iPhone. What an incredible step backwards it is. It's just a phone. It's a radio. It doesn't show video. It doesn't call. You can't access the worldwide information internet on it. You can't do anything with it. It won't tell you the weather. It's just a radio. It's a phone. And so, you spend the first half of your life wishing you had a communicator from Star Trek, and then you spend the second half of your life thinking, what a piece of crap this communicator is compared to the thing I've actually got. That's the kind of moments when you wake up and realize, the world's not all that bad. Of course, home ownership of phaser technology's fallen way behind home ownership of communicator technology, and that is an oversight that somebody's going to have to correct, because when the first guy comes out with the first Model 1 hand phaser that does this, just shut up and take my money. So the tech of Trek is what makes Star Trek science fiction and not science fantasy. The fact that they not only made an effort, they built entire character lines and things around it. They gave you enough. In fact, they gave you more than enough. And I don't want to spend a lot of time later on talking about. I want to spend a lot of time talking about all the other Star Trek spin-offs. We'll talk a little bit about Trek the original series versus Trek the Next Generation. But what's really interesting, first of all, what's really interesting is, for those of you watching on YouTube, you won't know this, but there are commercials that pop up on the Ustream thing, and we're getting a commercial telling us just how awful I think Paul Ryan is. Yeah, good luck with that, losers. We'll talk about Paul Ryan next week. I got a lot to say about Paul Ryan. We're on our geekathon here. The technology in Star Trek, the original series, gave you enough of a fig leaf for you to believe that this stuff could really work. Phasers, photon torpedoes, warp drives, transporters, and stuff. As Star Trek evolved into Star Trek Next Generation, it got worse, and then by the time you got into Voyager, it got to be unbearable, where you didn't even use a plot line anymore. You didn't even have characters anymore. You just had jargon. You set up a problem with the jargon, and then you solved the problem with the jargon. Voyager's stuck one somewhere. Well, if we were to invert what if we were to take the navigation sensors and invert a sort of an inverse tachyon annular containment field and rewarp it through the Hawking coils to create an anti-proton stream? Wouldn't that somehow negatively influence the photonic thing of the nebula and be able to drive us back into time? So please stop that. I want to get into the important stuff about Star Trek. I want to get into the cultural stuff about Star Trek. So before we do, let's talk a little bit about how Star Trek happened. Somebody mentioned it in the comments that I have to make a note for myself here because there's something absolutely critical that I need to get to. I don't want to forget it. All right. Somebody made a note in the comments that unfortunately an afterburner I did a couple years ago is only visible to members at PJTV, but it's called the Dowd Conundrum, and it's not the best work I've done, but it's my favorite work. It's my favorite work. We did an afterburner where Maureen Dowd basically said that Obama, who'd just been elected, was Mr. Spock, and I did an entire afterburner in the outfit. I mean a real outfit. I got the exact color of velour I found of all of the possible imitation jerseys you can find for the Star Trek original series. If you really want to make a point of looking like that guy, then you can find hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of yellow jerseys, but you can only find one that is made of the right velour with the right crest and the right stitching, and I found the person and I had one of those made. And then I found a guy who built a 3D bridge set, and I did some animation on the lights, and then we built a green captain's chair that had the exact same dimensions as Kirk's chair. In fact, that's a little interesting sub-story on the Dowd Conundrum. When we first tried to key me, we're going to chroma key me into a digital set. So I'd rendered the Star Trek set from a number of different perspectives because I've got a lot of background in 3D. So I do a close-up and I do a wide bridge shot and I do a left shot, so you see one panel, and then another shot, you'd see the other panel, and then I'd put myself into those shots. And when we originally started to do it, we just had me sitting on a green chair, which we draped some green cloth over, and the cloth wasn't keying real well. And we were having a hard time doing the lineup, so we realized, hey, wait, if we were to build Kirk's chair and paint it chroma key green, then since the actual chair is rendered in 3D, and that's going to be part of the image, then all we have to do is a little tricky, but then all we have to do is superimpose the model image over the chrome chair image, and if you get those two things to line up perfectly, the chrome image and the chroma key chair and the CG chair, you get the angles on those things exactly, then all the rest of the perspective is going to work. And so the question is, how do you build out of plywood, how do you build a captain's chair that is the right size? And the internet never fails to amaze me. There's so much wrong with the internet. There's so many idiots and nastiness on the internet. But I searched the internet in the space of about a minute, less. I was able to get the actual blueprints that they built the actual chair for the original series. They're online, and I gave them to one of our guys at PJTV, and he went out with a saw and basically built the captain's chair. It's amazing to me that, with just for 30 seconds of searching, I can find a copy and print a copy of the actual blueprints used to draw the actual chair. It's fantastic. We're going to be doing a lot of this little wandering around tonight because, like I said, this is a geek fest, and I'm going to go till I'm tired. So brew some coffee. Incidentally, I can't get the picture online, but they sell online working models of Captain Kirk's chair. They're absolutely perfect. They got the black leather, they've got the wooden armrest, they've got all the buttons, and you hit the buttons and the lights light up and it swivels. It's absolutely identical to the original series chair. And I think one version of them costs about $1,600, and I think another one costs like $4,000. So I'll be starting a collection for that after the show is over because I have to have one of those chairs. I have to. When I have enough money so that I can afford to do these kind of things, you're not going to see me wearing a $7,000 watch or a $20,000 or an $80,000 or $100,000 watch. You're going to see me with a $100 watch and Captain Kirk's chair in the back. They also make, by the way, a perfectly reproduced B9 robot from Lost in Space, and that robot was my friend. I love that robot. So I'm going to have one of those in my room, and I'll get a Robbie, a life-size Robbie the robot from Forbidden Planet. And we're not going to talk about Forbidden Planet tonight only because we've done Forbidden Planet before. I want all that stuff. I want a big Jupiter 2 model. I want an Enterprise original model. I want one the size of the wall, and I want an Enterprise A the size of the wall. And since we're on that subject, before we get back to the important stuff, I'll just say this. The USS Enterprise from the original show is an awesome, it's, what's the word? It's iconic. It will never go away. It's part of the culture. But everybody has a different opinion, and people don't have to agree with me, but if you disagree with me on this one, then you're wrong. Enterprise, the movie Enterprise, NCC 1701 and 1701A, the movie Enterprise and all of the movies that you first saw in Star Trek the Motion Picture, that Enterprise, Enterprise A, is the best looking spaceship that's ever been designed. That thing is just absolutely stunningly gorgeous. They took the original show Enterprise and they put some muscles in it, and they made it look a little realer and a little tougher and a little faster, but it is spectacular. It's spectacular. And if I don't remember it, remind me in the comments when we get to original show versus the Next Generation. Remind me about Enterprise D, which I'll talk about later. So we did a show called The Doubt Conundrum, and did the whole thing on the bridge of the Enterprise, and I spent a fair amount of time debunking the whole idea of an elitist like Obama, why you don't want an intellectual to be running the show. You don't want an intellectual. Spock is an intellectual, and when Spock is in charge of the Enterprise, because Kirk is away for whatever reason, the Enterprise is in deep trouble, and everybody knows it, and Spock knows it. In fact, the whole first movie was about, the reboot movie a couple years ago, was about Spock basically taking enormous risks to make sure that Spock didn't get to be captain, that Kirk was the captain. So let's talk about the original series for a bit and how it got there, and talk about Kirk and Spock and McCoy. Gene Roddenberry was a producer of police shows, and Roddenberry often talked about Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars, that it was going to be like a Western, but that's not what he wanted to do. What Roddenberry's original motivation was for Star Trek was a series of novels that were popular. At the time, they're still somewhat popular. About a young captain in the Royal Navy named Horatio Hornblower. And Horatio Hornblower was a young captain who was given a command of a frigate or something like that, a Royal Navy frigate, and he was supposed to sail it around the world. And so he would find himself, remember, messages traveled at the speed of a sailboat in those days. So if Hornblower is 4 months or 6 months away from England, then Hornblower is England. And that I read that that really appealed to Roddenberry, was the idea that the captain of that ship, Horatio Hornblower, was not just the captain of his ship. He was Great Britain. He represented the king and the empire, and he had to be the kind of guy who would be able to represent them and start a war, end a war. You don't get to get on the radio and talk to the higher-ups. You have to make those decisions that will determine the entire course of your civilization's history, and it comes down to one young man standing on the deck of a ship on the other side of the world. That's what Gene Roddenberry liked. He really liked the Horatio Hornblower series. So Roddenberry did something that I don't know if has ever happened before, because it's extremely rare. Roddenberry produced a pilot for Star Trek called The Cage, and it starred Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Christopher Pike. And Hunter was a very introspective, very brooding kind of guy. And The Cage is not just good science fiction for television. The Cage is just superb, excellent science fiction. It's everything that science fiction should be. It examined very deep issues. It was the one that eventually got turned into the two-part original series episode called The Menagerie, where they go to the planet, and I'm totally so ashamed of myself because I used to know every single one of these geek references. I've forgotten the name of that planet now. They go to this it's Forbidden Planet in a way, where these aliens have the ability to put thoughts in your mind and make you see what they want to see. And so you don't know what you're seeing. And you follow Christopher Pike as he goes through all these adventures, and he figures out that all this stuff is going in his mind. And then he begins to realize that many things that he thought were the case, like the wall of the prison being intact, no, he shot a phaser at it. The phaser didn't have any effect. And then later on he realizes, no, the phaser did have an effect. It's just that I can't see it. So he threatens one of these guys to blow his head off with this supposedly non-working phaser. And then the alien releases the illusion, and he sees the hole in the cage wall. And that Talos 4, thank you, Hockey. I'm going to have to buff myself up. How could I have forgotten that? I don't deserve to live. What that moment when you realize that everything that he saw was put in his head, not just the fantasy adventures, but the stuff that was actually going on in the cage. That's just excellent. I remember watching it and went, whoa. That's what science fiction does. When science fiction is working, it makes you go, whoa. And that was a whoa moment. So Roddenberry produces this pilot called The Cage, and he shows it to the network executives, and they hate it. They hate it. They hate it because it's intelligent, it's deep, it's thoughtful, it's unusual, it's groundbreaking. That's not what they wanted, and that's not what Gene promised him, by the way. Gene went out and made his Horatio Hornblower series, and he gave him what he wanted, not what he told him. He told him it would be Wagon Train to the Stars. Let's remember, we're talking 1965, 66 in here, and television is nothing but westerns. You got Gunsmoke, Big Valley, you've got, Rawhide, you got all this stuff. They wanted a western in space. But NBC looked at The Cage, and they realized that this was actually a work of genius. There's something there. There was something there. And so NBC did something that I don't know has ever happened since then. Maybe if it has, it's happened once or twice. They asked Gene Roddenberry to do a second pilot, a different pilot. Give me something different, but keep parts of it. Make me another pilot. So they did make another pilot. And the second pilot was called Where No Man Has Gone Before, which also was very clever, very interesting, about a guy. They go through a radiation belt, and Kirk's friend gets godlike powers, and they have to kill him before he becomes too powerful. That's an interesting moral issue. But the second pilot didn't star Captain Pike. It starred a young Canadian actor named William Shatner. And this time, William Shatner was much more action-oriented. He was rolling, and he had a laser rifle, and he fist fights, and he gets the girl, and he's a much more action-oriented guy, not nearly as thoughtful or cerebral or as a loner. He's a much more of a cowboy, really. He's much more American. I'm going to see if I can get PJ TV to release the Doubt Conundrum, because it's really, I just love it so much. I love it so much. Anyway, that's the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, became the template for the Star Trek that we know. It introduced, Mr. Spock was a science officer on the first one, but he became the executive officer and so on and so forth, started the whole Kirk and Spock thing, but you really didn't get to the meat of it until I think it was probably episode 3 of the original series, where you first meet McCoy. And then now you're in the golden age. So Roddenberry took a chance and got a show that was more intelligent than NBC wanted, and then he kind of, I don't want to say he dumbed it down a little bit, but he actioned it up. You could certainly say that. And you get the original series cast. You get these guys right here. The backup cast is interesting. Uhura was interesting. I always loved Scotty. I always thought Scotty was awesome. When Scotty was in the chair, I was always very happy. Chapel was kind of a nothing burger, and Chekhov was kind of a, Chekhov came in later, I think his second or third season, I think second season, I guess. And Chekhov was put there because the Beatles were so popular and the Monkees were on TV and they wanted a mop top for the show. So welcome, Ensign Chekhov. I always thought Sulu was just unwatchably bad actor and whatever. But ignore the 5 people in the back and concentrate on the 3 people up front. Because the 3 people up front are not really 3 people. They're really one person. They're really one person. The Enterprise is commanded by a triumvirate, like a trinity. I'm not the first person to come up with this, mind you, but it's really profound once you really think about it. So on the left, you have Dr. McCoy, and McCoy represents all of these human emotions. McCoy represents emotion. He represents passion. He's an idealist. He's compassionate. He feels sympathy. He wonders about the human cost. He's always worried about the emotional effect on people. He's passionate. He's very excitable. He's very moody in many ways. So McCoy represents emotion. Spock represents reason and rationality and logic and all of those kind of upper level things. Spock is the left brain and McCoy's the right brain. And so Spock represents all of our rational side, and McCoy's weakness is that he's too emotional and not rational enough, and Spock's great weakness, and this is why the point I was making in the Dowd conundrum, Spock's weakness is that he's purely logic and reason and so on. He is no heart. He has no heart. He has no passion. He's half human, so it's underneath the surface, but he represents the Vulcans. Now, the Vulcans in Star Trek, the Vulcans are really angels, right? They're angels or elves. They're a race of super beings. They're the super beings that live among us, like the elves in Lord of the Rings. The elves are in every way superior to mankind. They're faster, they're stronger, they're more accurate, they're smarter, they live forever, they have a tremendous culture, and yet the world is run by humans. Isn't that interesting? The same thing with the Vulcans. The Vulcans are far smarter than humans. They're stronger, much stronger physically. They're much tougher. They have a much older culture. They don't fight wars. They have all of these powers of logic and reason and rationality, and the Federation is made up of humans. Why? Because the humans have something that the Vulcans don't have. The humans have something that the elves don't have, and the humans have something that the angels don't have. The humans have a soul. They have a heart. They have a flaw, and that fatal flaw in the human heart is why angels and Vulcans and elves both despise and look down on humans and yet admire them and envy them, because they know that humans have something that they'll never have. It's the imperfections in the human heart that creates the human spirit, and that human spirit, to overcome those imperfections, is what makes Star Trek Star Trek. It's the urge to explore, it's the urge to discover, it's the urge to overcome our warlike past. It's all of those things. It is the heart of humanity that creates the spirit that allows the Starship Enterprise and the entire Federation to exist, because the Vulcans could have had a federation. They could have populated the entire galaxy, but they didn't. These super beings of the mind, these intellectuals, are broken. They're pitiable creatures. There's something wrong with them. They're missing something. They have no heart and they have no soul. Humans go where angels fear to tread, writes Rich there in the comments section. Exactly correct. Or where angels don't care to tread, or where angels don't think it's worth treading. It doesn't matter. It's the human weakness. It's the horrible flaws in humanity. It's the lack of reason and the overabundance of emotion. Yet McCoy is flawed too. You have to have the reason, you have to have the logic. You can't build a warp drive if you're just... You got to have them both together. But when you put those two things together, you have magic. And some people have said that, and somebody in the comments just said that McCoy represents the ego, and that Spock represents the superego, and that Kirk is the ego. That's one way to look at it. I think the way to look at it is McCoy is emotion, Spock is reason, and Kirk is the will. He's the will. Kirk has the will to act, and the will is what makes Kirk Kirk. Kirk is he's the only really fully human person on the show. McCoy is a half a person, Spock is a half a person, but Kirk is whole. Kirk has to balance these things. That's Kirk's job. That's the job of the will. Kirk has to decide, do I listen to my emotional side when McCoy says, don't do this? Or do I listen to my reasonable side when Spock says, yes, do this? Kirk has to decide, and ultimately you have to decide. And that's the point I was making in the Dowd conundrum. You don't want a half-person like Mr. Spock or Barack Obama, who I don't think is terribly bright, by the way, but you don't want one of these intellectuals who thinks he knows everything in charge. You want a person of will. You want a person with a broad set of experience. Kirk is nothing like as intelligent as Spock, but Kirk is infinitely wiser than Spock is, all the time. Spock's game is chess. Kirk's game is poker. If people behave like mathematical particles, then you probably would want a chess guy who could look out 15 moves in the future into the perfectly inviolate, perfectly predictable future and determine what's going to happen. But life isn't like that. Life is random and chaotic, and people especially are random and chaotic. And when you've got a a game like that to play, you don't want somebody who plays chess. You want a guy who can play poker. Yeah, the warp drives are offline, the phasers are depleted, the transporters aren't working, impulse power is down, we're surrounded by Klingons. They are calling for our surrender. Good thing that the hull of the Enterprise is packed with corpomite, and once I hit the self-destruct button, it's going to take out this entire quadrant of the galaxy, so you Klingons had better get clear of the massive explosion, because once the corpomite goes off, there's no telling what's going to happen. I mean, just look at that guy. Look at that guy. That is the American Adonis right there. That is Apollo. And by the way, the Enterprise is America. I said earlier that Roddenberry was trying to do Horatio Hornblower, that the thing that appealed to him the most about Horatio Hornblower was the idea that he represented his entire civilization. Kirk represents the Federation, and the Federation is America, right? It's a federation. It's not an empire. It's not a kingdom. It's not it's no emperor. It's a federation. Of course, America is the Federation. The Klingons are the Russians, and the Romulans are the Chinese. The Klingons are a brutal people with technology that looks like ours but isn't as good. But they manage to be out there because they're tough and they're heartless. So, we know who the Federation is. The Federation is America, and Kirk represents America. He is the idealized American. He's smart. Kirk is not an idiot. Captain Kirk is a very, very brilliant man. He's clearly a genius. He's nothing like as smart as Spock is, who is a super genius, but he has all of the attributes that Spock lacks. Likewise, McCoy's a very smart guy, but Kirk has it all. And this is the idealized American sitting on an American ship representing the United States of America out there in the wilderness. And he behaves like an American. He's gentle and he's kind to people who are nice, but he doesn't tolerate a lot of crap from people come at him with guns drawn. And all the people who say, oh, Star Trek is the great example of nonviolence, it's the great example of nonviolence. I wish we could be more nonviolent and be, just like on Star Trek. Well, they all went down there with phasers, folks, and they all... the Enterprise carried photon torpedoes and phaser banks, and it used them all the time because it's a dangerous world out there. And I think the very first essay, second essay or third that I wrote ever at Eject was called, the mind is the first thing to go, or second thing, I forget what the first thing is. Civilization, culture. So anyway, the point I was making there was the reason the Enterprise has phasers and photon torpedoes is because there's no point in advancing human goodness and freedom if all the good free people are dead, right? So, yeah, that's the original series. It's a magnificent thing, and we're going to spend most of our time on Star Trek. We'll pick up the pace as we get along here, but when we talked about the sci-fi adventure thing hopefully I was going to do it on Friday. Somebody wrote something in one of the posts on my Facebook page, and this is one of these things I hate more than anything in the world. I hate it when somebody gives me a great idea and then I go back to get their name so that I can credit them, but I searched high and low and I gave it as much time as I could, and I hope you're watching, and especially hope you're in the comment section, because if you made this comment, I think it's one of the most brilliant things I've ever heard. This does not belong to me. I'm bitterly angry at myself that I couldn't find the name of the person who came up with this. But this guy talked about the Prime Directive in Star Trek, and how the Prime Directive was the beginning of multiculturalism and really the end of Star Trek as we know it, and I think that is the most incredibly awesome insight I've ever heard about Star Trek. So let's talk about that. The Prime Directive, for all you non-Star Trek fans out there, as I'm sure you well know if you are a Star Trek fan, the Prime Directive was presumably, I thought, looking back on it, I thought, my God, the Prime Directive's been there from the first episode of the first original series, right? No. Prime Directive doesn't show up until the end of Season 2 in an episode called Bread and Circuses, where they go back to a planet that's modeled on the Roman Empire. And we find out that the Roman Empire was modeled on the fact that a starship crashed there 100 years ago, and that the survivors of the starship rebuilt this proto-civilization in the model of the Roman Empire, and it turns out it's a brutal place where they're doing live executions on TV and gladiators are having it out and all this nonsense. So that was an episode called Bread and Circuses. And apparently, episode 25, I think it was, of Season 2, so you're already 2/3 of the way through a 3-season run. You're 2/3 of the way through the original series when the Prime Directive first makes its appearance. And the Prime Directive basically says that the Federation has had a rule this whole time, which we've never heard about until the end of Season 2, but has had a rule this whole time called the Prime Directive. And the Prime Directive is the first and foremost law of the Federation. And that first and foremost law says that starship crews cannot interfere with the development of a planet. They cannot interfere with what the culture was going to be doing if they hadn't been there. So, okay, why is that important? Well, it's important for a couple reasons. It's important because prior to the Prime Directive, Kirk, representing America on the American ship representing the American Federation, went around through the undiscovered worlds of the galaxy and messed things up if he didn't like them. Because Kirk had enough confidence in his civilization, this is the point, had enough confidence in his civilization to know that he had the best civilization out there, that the Federation was superior to the Klingon Empire in every way. The Federation was superior to the Romulans. The Federation was superior to all these other cultures that debased humanity. The Federation was based upon the maximum potential of humanity, the maximum development of the human material. That's what the Federation was based on. And when Kirk would go someplace where people were not living up to their full potential, Kirk had enough confidence in his civilization so that he would go in there and change things. That's a profound difference from what happened when you get into the Next Generation, which I'll talk about briefly in a few moments, where the Prime Directive is the entire plot point of